Hi, Greg.
Hi there, Serge.
So you wrote a book about mirror neurons and demystifying their role. Maybe we could start with the beginning. What are mirror neurons?
Sure. Well, mirror neurons are cells in the motor cortex or motor system of macaque monkeys. They were discovered in the context of doing some basic research on motor control, trying to figure out how macaque monkeys, and by generalization, humans, may code movement plans in terms of object-based coordinates. That is, when you reach for an object, you have to take information about the object shape and location and size into account to guide your reach. You pre-shape your hand as you're reaching for a cup versus a pen, for example. And so Giacomo Rizzolatti in Parma and his group were studying this process in macaques, and they had discovered a class of cells in a motor area known as F5, or frontal area number 5, that seemed to respond, or that did respond, both to during reaching behaviors and during the observation of object shape. And the idea that they were exploring was that these were cells that were taking object shape information and using that to select from a vocabulary of possible grasps the appropriate grasp gesture for reaching that object. So they were studying this population of cells, and as they were swapping the objects in and out of the display case during the experiment, they noticed that some of the cells that they were recording from started responding to the experimenter's own actions. So these were cells that responded when the monkey generated movements, as well as when they were observing the experimenter generate similar movements. And this is basically the response properties of mirror neurons. They respond both during action execution and action observation. So that was the basic discovery in the context in which it was made. And then the big question became, what are they doing? What's going on with these cells such that they respond to actions as well as the execution of actions?
Okay, so from discovering that these very specific cells are activated during action and also during observation of action came the leap that they are responsible for more than that.
That's correct. So in trying to figure out what they were doing, the most obvious interpretation or function that these cells could be supporting is direct imitation. So if you have a cell, for example, that responds both during observation and execution, you might imagine that cell enables the animal to directly imitate actions that it's observing. And that was considered briefly early on after mirror neurons were discovered. But that possibility was ultimately rejected on the basis of the observation that macaques don't seem to imitate like that. They don't do a kind of direct imitation like humans do much more. And so that was discarded as a possible interpretation of these cells, and they were looking for other possible interpretations. Mm-hmm. There was a theory that had been around since the 1950s in the speech domain, my area of research, called the motor theory of speech perception, which held that when we perceive speech sounds, the goal of perceiving a speech sound neurally or computationally is not to recover its acoustic form, but to recover the gesture of the speaker. That is the motor plan that generated the sound that you're listening to. So it was very much a motor theory of perception. And mirror neurons kind of looked like that. They were responding during the observation of actions. And so the Parma researchers considered the hypothesis that maybe these cells are responsible for action understanding. That's how the monkeys understand others' actions. And the mechanism they proposed was one of simulation. And the logic kind of goes like this. When the monkey generates an action, say a reaching action towards something, it knows what it's doing. It knows its intentions behind the movement. When it observes another animal generating an action, if it can simulate those movements in its own motor system, then by the same token, it will be able to understand other people's actions. So you simulate to allow understanding, and that's the basic idea.
Yeah, but so in a way, the part in there is not just that it's possible to simulate in order to understand, but the question and some of what you discuss in your book is about the nature of understanding. Is how we understand things based on basically imitating the movement. And so it raises the question of how we know what we know and how we understand what we understand and how we attach meaning to things.
That's exactly right. The big problem with this idea is that that the movements themselves contain meaningful information, or that by observing or simulating the actions, it will automatically tell us what the meaning of those actions is. And if you think about it for a little while, it's obvious that it's not the case. And there's several reasons why, if we look closely. So, for example, if I reach for a pitcher and tip it over so that it pours water out into a cup, that action can mean very different things depending on the context. So if there's no water in the pitcher, it's just a tilting motion. It doesn't really do anything. It's not pouring. If there's water in there, then we can think about it as pouring. If we think about it from the perspective of the cup, then it's filling. And the movements are identical, so you can generate very similar identical motor patterns and achieve the same goal. Mm-hmm. So the movements really don't define the meaning. They're actually quite ambiguous, and it really depends on the context. And a lot of the mirror neuron experiments demonstrated this, that the same movement that the monkey observed gave rise to mirror neuron activity, not depending on the movement, but depending on the context. And that's in the mirror neuron literature. So it's not the movements themselves that are defining it.
So the interesting part then is that, it's more complex. The movement itself is one source of information, and the processing involves many sources of information.
Right. So in order to understand something, you need all this additional context, and the movement is only a small part of it. It may be that perceptually it's an important part, obviously, to process the movement, but it doesn't mean that simulating that movement in your own body is going to tell you much of anything. And we know empirically that in individuals who don't have the ability to move, they seem to be able to understand the world quite well. We all can understand actions that we've never performed previously, say a reverse slam dunk in a basketball game, for example. Not many of us can do that, but we can understand that quite well. And other animals that have movements that we can't possibly generate, we can still understand. So flying or slithering or things like that. And there's good evolutionary reasons why we would want to understand the actions of other animals, because sometimes they're predators and we want to know what they're up to. Sometimes they're prey. We want to predict what they might do so that we can catch them better. So there's lots of reasons why we should have neural systems that allow us to understand the actions of others without having to simulate these actions.
So in other words, what you're saying is that mirror neurons are certainly a source of information, but they're not the source, and certainly not the source of meaning.
Well, not quite. The way I view mirror neurons is they're essentially important for motor control. That just like these cells in F5 are important for using sensory information about object shape to guide action selection, I see mirror neurons as doing exactly the same thing. They're using, except instead of using object shape, they're using action. They're using dynamic information about movement to guide responses. Generally, you can understand that the actions of other animals, other people, other animals, is important for selecting our own actions. If I thrust my hand out towards you when we first meet, you'll likely respond with a similar gesture to shake hands. If I do something else, like throw a punch, you're going to want to select a different action, a blocking or a ducking action, for example. And presumably this is very important in the monkey world as well, and it's that sort of action selection function that I think mirror neurons are actually doing. I think the understanding is coming from different circuits. It's coming from sensory circuits that are involved in recognizing actions, connecting them to meaning, integrating them with context, and all sorts of things. The involvement of the motor system is just to select actions that are appropriate to the understanding that we get from other systems.
Is there maybe some kind of a hierarchy there of some things that some situations where there's more instinctual reactions and some cases where there's more involved, more processed reactions?
Well, certainly it's the case that we have sort of reflex-like responses. So like I said, if I throw a punch at you, reflexively you're going to duck or block or do something like that. I think one way to think about it is in terms of general brain organization into what's often been referred to as dorsal and ventral streams, sensory streams. So the dorsal stream is thought to be involved in sensory motor integration. This is a parietal frontal circuit that is taking sensory information and using that to guide actions, and that is can be thought of as a more reflexive, online, immediate system. That's the system that mirror neurons are part of. And then there's a ventral stream circuit that's more involved in recognizing what is going on in the sensory environment. And you can think of that as taking sensory information and trying to link it up to medial temporal lobe structures that are involved in memory, episodic memory, all sorts of things like that. So you can think of it as kind of hierarchical in the sense that you have in some sense, a lower level sensory motor circuit that can respond reflexively, taking information from a more cognitive or higher level conceptual system that's involved in recognizing, attaching meaning, attaching emotional relevance to information that's in the environment. So yeah, I think it is kind of helpful to think about organization of these circuits in terms of that kind of hierarchy and placing mirror neurons and other sensory motor circuits within one stream that's not particularly involved in recognition, but involved in taking action.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And involved in taking action, but there is a difference anyway in the action that's being taken in terms of the context. So that's where you would make the difference, say, between the action you take at first and then the action you take once more you've had time to process in a higher level.
Yeah, certainly it's the case that some things are very reflexive. I mean, generally you can think of the nervous system as being layers of control. So at the lowest level you have things like spinal reflexes, which will get triggered automatically. But then on top of that you have other circuits that are built to modulate that low-level reflexive response, because we don't always want to respond reflexively. Sometimes, depending on the situation, we may not want to release that hot pan knowing that it might make more of a mess if we drop it than if we quickly set it down or do something else. So yes, it's always the case that we have some sort of higher level control over these things. So we can decide after observing an action and understanding it whether we want to respond to it or not. And of course there's degrees of how reflexive our responses are. Mm-hmm. But I think the important thing is that that mirror neurons are essentially in a motor control circuit, that they aren't the basis of understanding. They're kind of the end point of understanding. They respond after the understanding takes place, which is very much characteristic of the way that these cells respond in monkeys. So, for example, in one experiment, the researchers placed an object behind a screen so that the monkey couldn't see it anymore, and then reached for it, and mirror neurons fired. It's interesting that mirror neurons will not fire if the experimenter is reaching for nothing or just pantomiming a reach. That object has to be there in order for that to happen. But it doesn't physically have to be there in the sense that you can put it behind a screen if that is physically in view. You can put it behind a screen, the monkey knows it's there, and it will respond to it, even though it can't see it. So
I want to just interrupt you here because
Sure.
as you're talking, you're clarifying something for me. When you first said at the beginning of your answer something that understanding comes first, in a way it takes me a little bit in a loop because I think of the word understanding as referring to more conceptual, abstract understanding, as if in a way rational thinking preceded action. And as you're talking more about this, it's actually something different that's coming up. It's not understanding as some kind of an abstract reasoning, but having a context so that reaching is not a gesture in and of itself, but it's reaching for something. And it's that mixture of a gesture and the goal and the total context that is what you call understanding, or is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if we just go back to the experiments that show when mirror neurons fire and when they don't, they will fire if there's an object to be grasped. They won't fire if there's not an object to be grasped, and that's going to depend on the context, the non-motoric context. And so there's got to be some level of understanding of what the goal of that actual action is going to be before the mirror neurons will even fire. The typical interpretation out there in terms of mirror neurons is that they fire to tell you what the goal is. But if they're firing if they have to know what the goal is in order to fire, then some level of understanding needs to be taking place before this circuit gets recruited. And so, yes, I do think that there is some sort of a contextual understanding of what the goal of a reach is and what actions that might map onto in the monkey before these cells will actually fire.
Okay, so then in a way, even at the level of something relatively basic like mirror neurons, we're still in a system where it's not just sensory is pure stimulus and pure stimulus gives the reaction. But even in that case, we have a more complex process where we are attaching context and processing information before the reaction happens.
Sure, yeah, and just think of your everyday life. If we were completely reflexive, every cup, every object that you looked at, you would reflexively reach for, or anyone who reached out for something or did something, you would mirror it. Perform a similar action.
When you say this, actually, it's an interesting part. One of the reasons that the concept of mirror neurons caught on so well with psychotherapists is that in our everyday life seeing clients, we catch ourselves mirroring, quote unquote, the movements, the hand gestures, the body language, the moving of hands, the moving of leg of our clients, and vice versa. So in that way, it's very tempting to jump into it and say, oh, this must be mirror neurons, quote unquote.
Yes, that is a documented phenomenon. It's referred to as the chameleon effect, and it's something that I discuss in the book, in the chapter on imitation. Humans do it. Macaques don't do it, which is kind of interesting, because macaques have mirror neurons, and they have the system that presumably would allow this, and yet they don't do it. So it's something beyond mirror neurons that's actually allowing this ability. What's it for? It seems to serve a social function. So these sorts of things have been demonstrated experimentally in work that has people performing an irrelevant task in the company of a confederate to the experiment who's generating some behaviors, and when the confederate scratches their head, the experimental subject will tend to scratch their head, and so on. The interpretation of this chameleon effect is that it's serving a social function to essentially enable social acceptance or provide in-group status or something like that. It's interesting that humans tend not to imitate or mirror people that they don't like or don't identify with. So this isn't, it is a kind of unconscious imitation, mirroring, if you want to call it that. But it is not a dumb process. It's not a reflexive process. Presumably what's happening, as with the case of other kinds of mirroring or motor control, is that there is some sort of higher level circuit that is controlling or enabling this process to take place. And it's that process. We want to understand what's happening with this kind of chameleon effect mirroring. Mm-hmm. We need to think about what this higher level circuit is doing such that it can activate the lower level mirror-like circuit.
Right. And so, the image of mirror is the same that, say, can be used in contemplative approaches to life. That wish that our mind were like a mirror that simply reflects the world as it is, and with some training and skill, we can eliminate what gets in the way of that and have the purity of outside experience. And what you're reinforcing and what you're saying is that actually everything in our brain is designed to interpret experience as opposed to reflect it.
Well, if we look to perceptual science, the perceptual neuroscience, so you're talking about things that are way beyond my ability to kind of comprehend myself, fairly abstract things. But if we kind of ground those ideas in perceptual science, we know as a matter of fact that we don't simply perceive or resonate with the world. Our brain constructs actively a representation of what the world looks like. So yes, if that's true, even at the perceptual level, even in perceiving cups and things like that, then if you scale up to human experience or more complicated situations, that with more force is a construction of our mind in terms of how it interprets the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so, in a way, where does this bring us in terms of the concept of how we know what we know, how we experience how we conceptualize what we experience, and that whole concept and discussion you have in the book about, embodied experience, embodied cognition. On the one hand, it seems like we must have evolved in a way that we developed abilities to deal with the world that were more complex but based on simpler processes. On the other hand, such possible mechanisms as mirror neurons appear flawed as explanations of it.
Yeah, the embodied cognition movement is an interesting thing. I think there are parts of it that are quite accurate and reasonable. So one of the things I like about it is the movement tries to take complicated cognitive processes. And cognitive is kind of a loaded term, as I talk about in the book, but complicated processes like categorization or problem solving or decision making, things like that, and try to think about how these might be done in terms of lower level circuits, sensory motor circuits. And I think that's an interesting research direction to take. Where I think that the program has gone wrong is this notion of simulating. So basically the idea is this, the way we think about, say, cats or dogs or something, is we simulate the sensory experience, and that's often taken as an explanation of how it's done. Oh, we just simulated in the concept of cat in our sensory and motor systems or whatever, and that's how we understand it. But this actually doesn't tell us much at all. I mean, simulation is just a term for basically information processing, and what we really want to do is figure out what happens in the initial process. So to say that we simulate our experiences with cats in order to understand them, that's fine. But then we want to know, well, what is this experience with cats? How is it coded in our sensory motor systems or whatever, to give rise to our understanding in the first place? That's to say that we simulate it doesn't really help. It just kind of renames the problem, essentially.
Right. It's like calling it a process, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. And so the embodied program is interesting, but I think as a replacement for traditional cognitive psychology, it has failed. It doesn't really change much of anything except to look for lower level processes in the brain, which themselves are quite abstract, in trying to explain some of these higher level behaviors.
So the flaw, as you see it, is that it tries to provide an explanation for what happens, but in a way that doesn't match the information we have about how it happens.
That's right. There's lots of empirical evidence that I discussed in the book showing that essentially you don't need a motor system in order to understand actions. And I go through that in the speech case, which is a domain that mirror neurons were first generalized to in humans. That really, speech was really the human connection between monkey mirror neurons and what's happening in humans, because we have a lot more data on that. And then there was this motor theory that was of speech perception that was out there. Incidentally, that theory had been rejected by speech and language scientists before mirror neurons were discovered. So it was kind of a poor analogy to use to help interpret mirror neurons, since the theory was essentially dead. But there's evidence, for example, that individuals with cerebral palsy who can't control their speech muscles and have never spoken can nonetheless understand speech quite well. There's examples from people who can't move and can understand actions quite well. For example, in apraxia or in congenital disorders like cerebral palsy or ALS or other things like that. There are examples of people who can't generate emotional facial expressions. This is Mobius syndrome, who can nonetheless understand emotional facial expressions as well as anybody else. Mm-hmm. So there's example after example like this that show that you don't need the ability to move in order to understand. So this explanation is just empirically false.
Right. So it's not necessarily that we are replicating the movement in order to understand it, but that maybe the information about movement is accessed by that part of our brain or mind that processes information, that processes representations, and is part of premotor, influences our premotor information.
Yeah, I mean, there's another area that isn't discussed much in the mirror neuron literature that's been discovered in macaque monkeys as well as in humans, and that's the superior temporal sulcus, which seems to respond quite well to the perception of all sorts of movements and eye gaze and interesting interactions between eye gaze and observed movements and this sort of thing. And this region is probably the hub for understanding actions. In humans, it's been involved in biological motion perception. So it's a good candidate for an area that is processing this sort of information and relating it to contextual information, to long-term memories, to all these sorts of things. And I think for actions that are recognized in this way and that are appropriate for generating a response, because not everything we observe is selected for response, then this information can be via the sensory motor, parietal frontal circuits can then be mapped onto motor circuits for action selection that may or may not be mirror related. So if I thrust my hand out to shake your hand, you're going to generate a mirror movement. But if I, like I said, throw a punch, you don't want to generate a mirror movement in that case. And so I see this mirror neurons as part of a much broader sensory motor circuit, only some of which are coding mirror-like movements.
Great.
There are plenty others that code anti-mirror movements, and those were actually discovered alongside mirror neurons in macaque monkeys in the original experiments, but those were not discussed theoretically.
Great. So, Greg, is there something else you might want to say to conclude this conversation?
Well, there's one other topic that I dealt with in the book that might be of interest, and that's autism. Because the broken mirror theory of autism has been quite popular. And like many theories of autism, it assumes that something is broken, that these individuals have a lack of empathy or an inability to empathize or to do such things, to read other people's minds and things like that. But there's another possibility, and that is that they're hypersensitive, which can lead to avoidance behavior, which can then affect their ability to, when you assess them, the ability to show empathy. Not because they can't do it, but because they're avoiding it.
They're flooded, and therefore avoided.
Exactly. So there's lots of reasons to think that a mirror neuron hypothesis, and even just a deficit hypothesis for autism is valid, and there's lots of data to suggest that we should be considering alternative possibilities. So that's another thing that was discussed in the book that may be of some interest to people.
Great. Well, thanks, Greg.
Sure. Thank you.
This recording is part of the podcast at relationalimplicit.com.
Such things to read other people's minds and things like that. But there's another possibility, and that is that they're hypersensitive, which can lead to avoidance behavior, which can then affect their ability to, when you assess them, the ability to show empathy. Not because they can't do it, but because they're avoiding it.
They're flooded, and therefore avoided.
Exactly. So there's lots of reasons to think that a mirror neuron hypothesis, and even just a deficit hypothesis for autism is valid, and there's lots of data to suggest that we should be considering alternative possibilities. So that's another thing that was discussed in the book that may be of some interest to people.
Great. Well, thanks, Greg.
Sure. Thank you.
This recording is part of the Somatic Mindfulness and Relational Psychotherapy podcast. See the website relationalimplicit.com.